Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Grand, CEO here at MedTech Innovator. Welcome back to MedTech Innovator Live. This is our webinar series that we do as part of our accelerator program every year. It's something that if you haven't been here before, I'm going to give you kind of the basic explanation for how this works. We have a cohort of companies that are part of the MedTech Innovator Accelerator. These are companies that range in stage from early stage, meaning they probably have prototypes and initial evidence, all the way up to companies that are on the market. So this accelerator webinar series is designed to answer a lot of their questions in a very rapid and convenient way. And because these are generally topics that are applicable to the entire MedTech ecosystem, we open these broadcasts up so that anybody can join. The questions that we're going to be discussing for most of this conversation are ones that were submitted in advance by the companies that are part of the MedTech Innovator Accelerator cohort. In total, we have 60 companies that are part of the US program this year, 50 that are part of our main cohort, and 10 that are just in pediatrics. So that's the general lay of the land for what we're going to be talking about. Our discussion today is going to be on engineering and manufacturing, and specifically tips for success. And I think what we generally say when we think about MedTech Innovator and what our goals are here with this program is that we're trying to have a forum where people can avoid making mistakes. The companies that we select to be in our program are highly vetted. We had over 1,000 companies apply this year. We have the ones that we accepted in our program, and those companies are ones that we want to make sure succeed, and we want to make sure all of you succeed, anyone who's listening to this. So that's the goal here, is to avoid avoidable mistakes and learn from people with lots of experience. So today we have a number of great panelists that I'm going to introduce shortly, and they're here as experts. They're all people who are on the front lines, who are involved in this particular space we're talking about and can provide their expertise. These are people also who there'll be some opportunity to follow up with as well after the event. For those of you who are on YouTube Live, you can use the YouTube chat to ask some questions, and if I can, I'll incorporate those into the conversation. For those of you who are part of our webinar and are part of the cohort, you're able to ask your questions here, as always, in the Q&A box, and we will get to those mainly at the end. So the first hour will be live for everybody on YouTube. The last 30 minutes will be just for the companies in our cohort. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists so you can learn a little about them. So I'm going to start off first with Mike from Jabil. So you want to introduce yourself, Mike?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I hope everyone's safe. My name is Michael Mahaz. I'm a Senior Business Unit Director with Jabil in our healthcare division. I've been with Jabil for 21 years and spent the last 8 of those years in our healthcare division supporting medical device customers. Jabil is a manufacturing, design, and supply chain solutions provider. We work with our customers anywhere from early engagements, where we'll support human factors analysis and product ideology, to design, but certainly our core business is manufacturing globally, leveraging our network of 110 plus sites around the world. So happy to be here, excited to be on the panel, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Terrific, Mike. Jabil is one of our newest partners this year, and we're really lucky to be partnered with you. It brings a real level of expertise just to all of our companies that you're working with directly in terms of understanding manufacturing. You know, it's stuff that typically these companies don't think about in a significant way until much later. So great to have you here, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
And I know we're going to be joined by Jim as well when he's back on. So we'll skip over now to Jacob Werlinger from Merz North America, Executive Director of Technical Operations. Jake.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jake Werlinger, responsible for technical operations at Merz North America. Been in the industry, both in drug and device, for the last 24 years, everywhere from quality, research and development, drug and device development, up to today. Now responsible for supply chain, operations, logistics, all in the device and drug space. Merz North America is responsible and has products in both the aesthetics and device arenas. So good afternoon, good morning, and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Jake. All right, next, Ken Stopar, also with Merz North America, Director of Supply Chain.
Yeah, hi everybody. Ken Stopar, and I have about 20 years experience in the med device industry, experience from product development on the device side to quality, supplier quality, and now most recently in supply chain, which I have the opportunity to manage our sustaining engineering, contract operations, and our global service and repair. So thank you all for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
Ken. Next, Jonathan Behm from Cardinal Health, Vice President of Strategic Sourcing.
Thank you. And John's fine. We'll leave that formal stuff for passports and emails, which the passport isn't getting used much these days. But warm welcome to everybody. Look forward to being part of this panel today. So a little bit about myself. I do work for Cardinal Health. We're based out of the Columbus, Ohio area, but we are a global supplier of medical devices, distribution, and various services around the world. I work in the medical segment of Cardinal, which does have a pharma distribution and medical segment. Within the medical segment, I'm responsible for our external manufacturers that supply us with private label or contract manufactured medical devices, about 55 different product categories, from basic, high volume, low cost items like some of the wound care products, all the way up to class 3 devices, feeding pumps, feeding sets, and in between. So I came to Cardinal about 20 years ago. My background originally in engineering and manufacturing, spent kind of the middle third of my career in marketing, as well as in product development, and then the last 10 plus years in strategic sourcing and procurement. So look forward to today, and a warm welcome to everybody.
Terrific. Well, it's great to have you guys all here. I know Jim Warren is also here from Jabil, but he's muted at the moment. Jim, are you able to unmute? And
Absolutely. Apologize for that, Paul. Just when you think you've got all your technical bugs worked out, it throws another one at you. So good morning. I'm Jim Warren from Jabil Healthcare. I've been with Jabil 22 years, and I work in business development. Thanks for having me this morning.
Thank you for being here. So just as a general statement for all of you, I know you all are with different corporations. This discussion is representing your personal views and not necessarily representing views of your overall organizations, or you're not representing the organization with your statements. So, you know, we treat this as individuals in these broadcasts. So I'll make that disclaimer for everybody.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So let's get into it. Now that we've got that behind us, one of the first things we always like to do is just ask people, you know, do you have a lot of interaction with startups, smaller companies in your various roles? And in that particular genre of question, then, are there any particular tips that you would offer to startups when they're thinking about contacting someone like you? So why don't I start off first with, I don't know, I think I'll start off first with Jim on this. Sure.
Yeah, in my previous role inside of Jabil, I was with our consumer division, and we dealt a lot with startups. A small piece of advice that I'd give startups is keep it simple. You may have a great idea, but unless you can explain it and articulate what you need from us, it's very hard to do that. And sometimes folks would come in too early. So I would make sure that you can describe what you're trying to do and what you need with a simple 2 minutes, and then we get into discussion. And that would be the advice I've given all the startups that I've had a chance to work with.
Great. And then how about if we move on then to John?
Yeah, thank you. Our company works with a whole variety of sizes and styles of companies, from startups through the major medical device companies. So my team does work often with brand new technology, whether it's at a component level or a finished good device level. I would echo what Jim has said relative to those tips, and a couple of the other tips I would give is, wherever you can bring unique insights for the market, that can be very valuable. Even to a large corporation like ours, you often might know your space even deeper, as well as found a way, you know, in a very probably, you know, cluttered field of what's going to catch the eye of those end product users. So Jim is spot on. And these days, it's really hard to get to the end users and the decision makers. So simple, crisp, and with some type of compelling, message that meets a customer need.
Great. Very good. Mike.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, Paul, one thing that's not really focused on very often early on is manufacturing, and just, some advice is, I appreciate there's so much you're trying to accomplish as a startup in getting your product to market and ensuring that it actually meets and delivers the therapy and the improved patient outcomes that you're striving for. But don't lose sight of the fact that really quality and supply chain resiliency is designed into your product. And trying to find time or find a partner to work with to work on that and ensure that as your product is launched and released to the marketplace, that you're embedding some of those core foundational pieces to your product.
Terrific. All right. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about some of the general before we get into some of the detailed questions that were supplied. I just kind of want to talk first about maybe some just initial mistakes that people make in terms of, especially with a smaller company in mind. What are things that you see coming on? Your people usually will come to a Jabil much later on in the process, perhaps when they're thinking about manufacturing, and boy, they have a whole bunch of stuff they made mistakes on along the way, and you go, God, I wish I could have, gotten to these guys a little sooner. So what are some of those things? I know there was some, pre-discussion about, being too simplistic and sometimes being too complex. And so, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. So who wants to take a shot at that first? Give me a hand.
Jump on it.
Go ahead, Jim.
I think one thing that people sometimes consider an afterthought, which really needs to be the first thought you have, is the documentation and a good understanding of regulatory. Sometimes you get too far down the path and you think you're ready with your 510K, and you take it as someone who knows what 510K submission is all about, and they find holes in it. And then you have to backwrite, and that can take a lot of time, and it can put you out of place. And it's generally not something folks have budgeted for. So I think documentation is critical, but what's more critical than that is finding a good regulatory partner or having someone who really understands regulatory on your team, so that when you do start, you're starting in the right way.
Great. And how about just in terms of, again, just this is now just kind of more general speaking. A lot of times startups I know are focused on just, getting their device to work, and, they're not thinking about some of the, the downstream effects of their early decisions, especially when, like I'm thinking right now in today's environment, a lot of people who were working on something that was more like prototypey, clinical prototype, suddenly are submitting an EUA, and they're going out and actually delivering products to customers a little earlier than maybe they thought about it. And then you're going to run into issues of manufacturing at scale and those things. So what are some of the things that you would just, kind of maybe comment on related to that? Problems, things that, you commonly see that people aren't thinking about. It could be supply chain, whatever. Like maybe what are some of your just general thoughts on that?
Sure. So supply chain is definitely a big one. Making sure that the parts that you've selected for the device can be attained in the time frame that you need them. You may have some of the best processors in the world, but if you can't get them inside of 16 weeks when you need them, then what's the point of having that? And I think also to that is really understanding end user data. What is it and how is it going to be used, the environment it's going to be in, if you've picked out the right parts and spec for that. So really looking at your device and understanding it holistically, and that includes the marketplace, and really understanding if the parts that you're picking are going to be able to help you turn on a dime. I think we've seen with COVID, there were a lot of folks that could have pivoted, but were not able to because they couldn't get the components that they needed in the time frame. And I think that speaks a lot to life cycle management as well. So those are the items that I'd point to.
Great, perfect. All right, so in terms of, you talked a little bit about documentation. What is, when you're thinking about FDA and what, in general, what's some of the documentation that these companies should be keeping during their product development? Go to Ken for this.
Yeah, so I think when you're looking at documentation and design control, start early as you can in terms of recording the documentation. The FDA has a ton of guidance out there for design control and good record keeping like that. But specifically, some good or best practices that I've seen are related to kind of following a trace matrix. So you have a number of requirements that you started with. making sure you have a trace matrix that kind of keeps everything organized, and it'll help you keep things well documented, and try to start design controls as early as you can, because you want to make sure you capture all the decisions that you're making along the way.
Yeah, well, how about a QMS? Is that, what's the right point for someone to actually have a QMS? How about Jake?
Yeah, I was going to build on something that Jim said earlier too around regulatory quality. It's never really too early. We found that, especially to Ken's point, that when you're starting even early on, having that documentation and having it up front, it's very difficult to go back and say, what did we do back then? And try to have to document that. And each step of that design control process, documentation is key. So what we found is that if you wait too late in the process, you're going back and having to remediate those documents even in the early phase.
Well, and let me follow up on that then. So going back to like the trace matrix you were talking about, Ken, is a trace matrix something you need like professional software for? Can you just do that in a spreadsheet? For an early company, what do you advise?
Yeah, I mean, it can be as simple as a spreadsheet where you're basically linking your requirements. It helps you keep organized to make sure that when you get into the later stages of design control, that you've truly verified all your requirements, and that it kind of keeps everything organized so that when you go to market, you have everything that you need in terms of documentation for design control.
Great. I know we get this question all the time. One of our companies asks a lot about hacks. Is there a hack that people can use to do an early design history file or something? What are ways to simplify for a startup? Where everything is complex for them. Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've seen in the past that works well to try to organize your DHF is I've seen in the past a DHF Index. So Index basically lists out your inputs, your outputs, your verification that follow that, any sort of validation, and then all the linking documents that you released that would be associated with each one of those major elements. Kind of keeps everything organized in a nice succinct fashion so that you can call upon any of the documentation in the future.
Yeah, good recommendation. Okay, great. How about common mistakes? And this may be the last thing we'll talk about when it comes to documentation. So, in general, what are some common mistakes that people make that you see, and what do you suggest for avoiding those? Either Ken or Jake, maybe?
Yeah, I can start a little bit, and then Ken, you can kind of build on from it. So some of the common mistakes that I've seen is that folks don't have their development plans documented and established. And so the part of the design and the decisions that are made throughout the entire design control process isn't documented. So it's really not understood how they got to certain parts throughout those phases. That's one area I'd recommend.
Okay, great. All right, very good. Thank you. So let's move on then, and let's talk a little bit about, and we'll come back to for the companies that are queuing up questions related to design history files and things like that. We'll get back to some of those in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about. Actually, I'm going to move ahead and jump, if you guys don't mind, to talking a little bit about just approaching a contract manufacturer. So I guess one of the questions always is kind of like, from a timing perspective, when is the right time to do that? So if you're thinking about things like design transfer and all that, again, like what's the right time for people to approach a contract manufacturer? Is it super early in their process and to kind of be prepared for things down the road, or should they what stage should they be at? And I'll go to I don't know. I'll go to Jonathan. I haven't called on you yet, John.
Sure. You know what? I think it varies. Again, I think it depends. If you have an existing relationship with a contract manufacturer, that trust has been established, you've done other development, my advice would be to involve them early and often. Even if it's just to set the stage of where it is, and maybe you're going to do all the development and even the IP and all that type of piece inside, but that way they have an idea of where it's going to be. Do they have the competencies? do they have the current capacity, right? Which, Jim and Mike would often tell you capacity is a lot of things. It's not just space, it's people, it's capital, et cetera. If it's a brand new relationship with a contract manufacturer, then my advice would be, to have things pretty much in order, with the intellectual property, your initial design and development there. But then, and I would include, the difficult part is there's such a wide range of contract manufacturers that are out there. You really need to do some due diligence of what's the core items you need from that contract manufacturing. Is it scale up? Is it cost? Is it finished development? What is it? Because again, Mike and Jim will tell you it's hard to be all things to all customers.
Yeah, and if you're following up on that, then you talked about lots of different contract manufacturers. So what are some best practices then for evaluating a contract manufacturer's ability to maintain design controls and just be a good partner in general? Jim, I'll go to you for that.
Sure. I think the early and often piece is important. Something that I think about is we guide a lot of people towards us and also away from us. And we'll tell you when to come back around. And we'll articulate what we think you need to have from a design controls perspective, or we can take a look at what you already have and offer those suggestions up. I think Mike can speak a little bit more to this as well, as he's had some involvement too, and I wanted to give him a chance to talk.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Mike.
I mean, I think when you're trying to evaluate a partner, what John said is a great point. You need to make sure you're very clear on what you're looking for, what you need, and ensure they have the base capabilities required. But I think once you get to that point, most importantly is, in many of these cases, this is your life's work, right? These startups are putting blood, sweat, and tears and all their passion into these products. And you've got to find a trusted partner, one that's going to scale with you, deliver value to you, and ultimately, be a trusted, safe pair of hands to support your product through not only the early phase and make sure, like I said earlier, we're helping you design in quality, helping you design in a resilient supply chain, but can scale up and is in it for the long haul.
Good advice. All right, let's talk about custom components versus off the shelf. That's something that we get questions about a lot. People are trying to make that decision and how complex should they go, and they're trying to figure that out, especially kind of in these early stages. So maybe let's just start off with just kind of as a general discussion. What are some of the risks that are associated with custom components? And let's say, how about if we start with Ken on that one?
Yeah, I guess it depends a lot on what and how custom the component is. First there's a number of factors in custom. You have to choose obviously the materials, then you have to choose the right supplier if it's custom. Then you have to make sure that supplier has the right processes. And so there's a lot of factors that go into a customization of a part and the supply of that, and making sure that it's obviously then manufacturable versus something that is off the shelf. So some of the risks associated with that are, if you have something so custom that it's unique to your device and you're locked into that, some of the risks might be that sole, from a supply and long-term supply perspective, some of that might be from a supply chain risk, right? You have, or material risk. So there's a lot of risks related to the supply of that part when it's a custom component.
John, anything you want to add to that? I think you're muted, John. There you go.
That the only piece I would add is take it a layer or two deeper than it appears. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you look at the design, you look at that, first, tier of component suppliers and such. But if you don't peel back the onion, you might not be aware of what's behind that, right? And okay, you dig into it, it's custom, they have enough inventory, things like that you can see. But if you're not looking to say who's the key critical suppliers to that supplier, and what we say is try to get as deep as you can, because somewhere there's a landmine in the supply chain. It's just a matter of how deep is it, how big is it, and we're all probably suffer from lack of patience. So that'd be my one piece of advice. Try to go as deep as you can on the tiers of suppliers.
Great. Well, I see both Mike and Jake want to chime in, so I'll start with Mike on that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with, don't lose sight of the fact that there's some inherent risk with off-the-shelf components as well, right? And the fact that those components, one, could change quickly without you being aware because they're off the shelf, they're readily used throughout the marketplace, and more importantly, can just go end of life. So I don't get comfortable in the fact that, hey, I'm using off the shelf, I'm secure, there's less risk there, because many times there's a lot of inherent risk in using off the shelf components as well. So just want to highlight that there's some risk there as well.
Yeah. And Jake, I'll get to you in 1 second. I just want to follow up on that, Mike. One question I have for you on that is, how do you determine that something's getting close to EOL? Is that something that the supplier discloses, or could that just happen at any time?
Typically they'll disclose, but I mean, there's a lot of support publications out there that you can get access to either through a partner or directly that monitors technology, monitors life cycle of a component, and will give you kind of a life cycle phase to say, what's the longevity of the part? Is it good for new use? Is it not advised for new use into new product development? So there's information out there available to you if you take the time to get into it. And I would certainly encourage folks who are developing new products to take time to do that, because the last thing you want to do is get your product completely validated, 510K approved, get ready to launch, and find you've got 3 or 4 end of life parts where you're going to get stopped in your tracks right as you're just coming out of the box.
Great. And Jake, I know you had some thoughts on this too.
No, Mike nailed it. I was just going to say that one of the risks are those changes and how those changes occur. Off the shelf can have those changes, and next thing you know, you find yourself into end of life situation. So that was one of the things to kind of consider as well.
Yep, Ken.
Yeah, and just going back to our couple discussion points that we had earlier about selecting contract manufacturer, and these are some of the things that a contract manufacturer might be in a position to help you, right? So you may have the best design and you have the most robust design, but a contract manufacturer may have a position to know what would be a good selection of an off-the-shelf component and things like that. So that's where oftentimes that selection of your contract manufacturer might come in and help you in quite a bit of a fashion there.
Yeah, I mean, I know one of the questions that comes up a lot from our companies is, if they're using something that's off the shelf and, they want to do their kind of, clinical or early work with custom components, what's the right time to move to custom? Like, how do they make that decision? Why don't we go with John on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I would say something that Ken has mentioned. One of the things we highly value in our, I would call, strategic CM partners is the level of depth that they can bring on the component supply market, especially if they have a wide range of customers that touch different industries. They'll have a better idea where we might be pretty myopic, just looking. I think we've all learned some valuable lessons with basic electronic components, that a lot of med devices are using. They're heavily tied to the consumer electronics market. And if some big person like Apple makes a big design change, it can reverberate all the way across multiple industries. Resins is another one that we run into. You tend to have various specialty resins in medical devices. And things can change, right? All of a sudden that profitability of that resin that is no longer there for the producer. And they might be, hey, guess what? You have a year and then we're done making it. And that seems like a long time, but that's not a long time at all for a class 3 device and everything you have to go through to make that change. So I think your suppliers can really help you out in these spaces. On custom components, I would say, if it's tied to a critical feature and benefit, especially intellectual property, then there's ways with your supply chain and with your supplier partners that there should be enough mutual value that you can figure out a way to secure that supply chain.
Mike.
And to follow up on that point, I think it's less about time and more about what John just said, the critical functionality of the part. I think if it's a part that's critical to the function of your device and critical to ultimately how it's going to perform, I don't think you need to wait, because it's going to be core to your product anyway. And you really want to secure and lock that up and make it more custom. So I think it's less about time and more about the functionality of the actual parts you're picking to be custom that you should be looking into and focused on.
Great. We had a question in the Q&A, which I normally would save to the end, but it's pretty relevant from one of our companies. So I'm gonna bring it in here, which is when you're changing components, it's pretty common then, that some of these things might be, as you said, might be discontinued, go end of life, et cetera. Now you got to swap it out with something else. And the question was, how easy is it? Again, I know none of you are regulatory necessarily, but if you can answer this, how easy is it to justify the equivalence of a substitute component for FDA? Does it require a complete EMC testing again and go through all the certification processes again? Is the question. So anyone want to take a shot at that? You can raise your hand, let me know. Mike.
I'll take a shot. I mean, and the answer is, of course, it depends, right, on the component. I mean, many components in a product design can be changed and replaced based on the predicate part that was there, based on where it is in the circuitry. So I'd say the majority number of parts, the mass quantity of parts, are going to be changed fairly seamlessly without a lot of revalidation. But again, that's where I go back to the critical functioning parts of the device. Those are going to require you to go back through, confirm that they function as the predecessor did, and potentially resubmit a 510K. That's why I think when you're talking about custom parts and where you focus your attention, it's really there because in those engagements and collaborations with component suppliers that are developing that part with you, you can lock them in on long-term contracts to support that device. So you reduce some of that risk of end of life.
Great, thank you for that. One of the things that I know we talked about in the prep leading up to today was, supply chain issues. And it's something that, of course, because of COVID, we've had even tighter crackdowns on things like bringing in goods from China or from other places that people were heavily relying on before. So I'm just curious, just kind of in general, and again, you can raise your hands, let me know, who wants to take a shot at this, but I'm just curious what the state is these days of the industry. Are we avoiding China entirely? Are we avoiding other locations? Do we have to go domestic now on, our manufacturing? Kind of what's the state of affairs? And what are you recommending to people? What are you seeing out there? Anyone want to take a shot? I got a couple of hands. John.
Yeah, again, medical device development timelines and qualifications and supply chains, tend to be lengthy, right? We'd all like them shorter, faster. So even with the issues we haven't run into any situation where we can say, hey, no longer doing business there or with so-and-so. It's certainly making you step back and think of, are you single, sole sourced? Do you put the investment for dual source? Do you try to diversify, where you are? I think we've seen restrictions literally all over the world. The pandemic and COVID has made governments and companies, have to make decisions that they never even thought about. So I don't think there is any one safe continent. It's just too unpredictable. I think you try to spread your risk. You try to have, responsive supply chains and have committed suppliers. I think you find out a lot about your supply base during these times. There's a lot of difficult decisions, right? That it could be very lucrative for some of your suppliers to chase, a relatively short-term opportunity at extremely high prices. So can you count on them? Are they going to try to break contracts? Things like that. If I've heard it once, I've heard it multiple times every week about, well, market pricing says, and that goes with it. So I think it's, we've all gotten a wake-up call, I think, all the way around the world. Somebody put it really well, right? This is probably truly the first and only global pandemic in the history of time. Think of world wars, think of other illnesses and things. This has affected everybody across the world, where somebody normally was isolated. So I think it just behooves you. You have to consider all options and things you wouldn't even thought of in the past.
So, and this is, I'm being specific here because we're getting this question, I get pretty regularly, which is, should we always have like a local backup? Should we, what do you advise people to do, I guess? Jake.
Yeah, so I was going to add on to John's comments. So, for not only is it about an international supply chain, so to speak, but something that Mike said earlier, which is the robustness of that. So as companies are thinking about parts and pieces and development and the sourcing of it, we've also seen with this pandemic, local supply chain stress. So partners that we have that are very small shops have been impacted, have closed their doors, and now we have a supply chain disruption because of bankruptcy of a local supplier. And the reason they were picked was, well, they were down the road, or they were, someone that we'd worked with in a past connection. And so, it kind of runs back to that first question about what do you recommend just in general. And some of that is looking at, that supply chain overall, the robustness. And when you're thinking about parts, not only about international, local, size, scope, all those things play a role. And it's a difficult kind of diligence to walk through. But a lot of times doing that and then looking at it again and again, it's not something that you do once and say, okay, well, we figured that out, now let's move on to the next thing. But constantly looking through that supply chain and understanding what's happening from a market standpoint, from a dynamic standpoint. And that kind of then rolls to that other question about, like, when do we bring in a CMO? Those are things that a good CMO can help you with early and often, because they're constantly doing that with other customers, with other parts and pieces around the world.
So maybe Jim, building on that then just a little bit, again, kind of like, so, Jake, you said you bring in a CMO. So is that how you mitigate the risk of a supplier going out of business? It's just have a good CMO who can, who's looking up and down the supply chain for you. Is that expected of them?
You always heard about the golden screw, right? You can have this great product and there's the one screw that costs a penny that you can't ship because you can't get that. I think there's risk inherent in everything. That's when you start looking at the dollar value. If I've got a penny screw, I could buy 100,000 of those and have them ready and available. If I've got an IC that's got a 16-week lead time, I better at least have die available for that if there's a spike in demand, or if there's a failure, or if there's a loss of a shipment. I think you've got to go through that risk analysis and be able to identify where your weak spots are. And those weak spots are generally associated to your inability to invest and to offset that. You can have multiple suppliers, but if they're all pulling that same single source component to their facility, and that's not available, then it doesn't matter how well you've stratified your manufacturing operation across the globe, you still can't get the parts. So I think it's to Mike's point earlier, you really have to dig in and you've got to go down multiple levels in order to understand your risk profile, identify what you're willing to invest to offset that risk, and cost your product accordingly. And if obviously they've got some products that are out there that are relatively cheap and you wonder, would they survive through a risk situation? I would say that it's really a roll of the dice at that point. So you really have to fully understand the market, understand your device, understand the customization aspect of it. So it's a very holistic approach that's not simple, but you can work with folks that have the talent that can walk through those models and be able to come back and give you a good argument as to why you need to invest the money in certain places versus others.
Ken, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just to add on to what Jim is mentioning regarding understanding your supply chain, understanding where the risk within the supply chain will occur. But one thing that you can do to help mitigate that risk is truly develop mitigation plans. So once you've done the assessment, once you've figured out where your risks are, now it's time to take action, right? So putting together plans on how you would approach each one of those situations and start to develop those mitigation plans so that if something were to happen, you at least have a plan or a game plan to how you would approach that situation based on the criticality and based on the assessment that you did of your supply chain.
And for for a startup. Oh, and actually, on Mike, I saw you wanted to chime in. Yeah, one more thing, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it's a delicate balance, right? You can't expect to have, a regional supplier in every node, when especially coming out of the gates when you don't have the volume, right? Because then the cost is just going to outweigh the benefit. I think, to your point, you need to align with partners who are agile enough to be able to read and react deep enough through the full supply chain. As Ken mentioned, have mitigation plans in place. In worst case scenario, be able to read and react and shift if required. And just to your earlier question about, are we seeing a mass regionalization shift in the market? I would say final touch, yes, meaning, the final touch of the product being as close to the end market as possible. In specific industries, certainly PPE, pharmaceuticals, that's certainly a shift in those particular markets. But for the upstream supply chain, specifically in the electronics market, it's still predominantly Asia. And that's not going to shift anytime soon. So kind of continuing to rely and get the economies of scale and get costs for the subcomponents there, and then maybe shifting the final touch and final integration closer to home is probably the trends we're starting to see in the marketplace.
Thanks. So I'm going to move on to design transfer as a topic. So let's think about that a little bit. So what are some of the delays, that can be involved with design transfer to a contract manufacturer? What are some of the, I guess, some of the things that could go into, delays? John.
Boy, I'll try to just pick out a couple of the common ones. I would say if you really think of root cause, that it tends to be poor definition of requirements. And that can happen in many spots along the way. It could be from gathering, what the true customer needs versus wants are, the translation of that from your marketing team to your product development team, all the way down the supply chain. If that handoff, if critical pieces of information are either not translated correctly or they're lost, then what happens is it always finds a way, right, to raise its ugly head, seemingly when you're doing a transfer to your CM, or the CM might find it. So that goes back to my involve them early and often. Even, if you have that kind of relationship, if you can build that, they might just be watching things and just be like, ask you a question or two, even though they're still 2 or 3 steps down the way. I think that's a way to try and offset that miss of information. And I think probably the other thing is just trying to have organizational patience and tell yourself it's okay to slow down to speed up. And that's really hard, right? Because if you're the next thing that's keeping this from moving, especially if it's a startup, which it could be financial challenges, it could be speed to market, whatever that is. I think it's, whenever you're feeling super rushed of the process, it's probably time to take a momentary pause, bring some outside eyes in, even if they're internal, because it's easy to get really myopic and get impatient.
It's really good advice. That slow down to speed up thing, I think, is probably a good general piece of advice for a lot of things that we all do with early companies, because there is that pressure. There is that pressure from your investors, from the market, from a milestone, whatever it might be. There's something where you're like, oh my God, I got to deliver, or maybe you've got a pilot or something, and suddenly you got to push out more units than you expected to. So I guess maybe kind of like following up on this topic again, what are some some specific kind of common mistakes that people make during this design transfer to the CM that we could help people avoid? So just things for people to be, the things that they don't know that they don't know. What are just some of those types of examples? And again, could be Mike. Yeah, please go ahead.
And this goes back to earlier conversation around documentation control, right? Yeah. And as things shift in your design, make sure they're documented. I can't tell you how many times, we'll get a documentation package. We'll go off and start to ramp up the supply chain, for a mechanical part or a plastic part. It comes in, it matches the design, but it doesn't match the functional part the gold sample or the functional part that was actually used for qualification and validation. And so now you're starting all over and causes a massive delay. So just making sure as tweaks and as changes are happening, those successes are then documented, documents are updated, drawings are updated, and that you have a complete package that's the latest and greatest and reflective of your gold validated sample to release to a manufacturer to work off of.
Yeah, the one thing I would add on to Mike's comments, in even a big firm like ours, we may be using a firm for the development and the initial scale up, and then transferring it to the CM as it's going to ramp up. And, everything might go great with you in that development phase at ARM, but we collectively weren't thinking ahead of what that design transfer is going to be, because what you need to do the development and scale it up and get prototypes and things isn't the same often as what you need to scale it up. And it comes back to, I think it was Mike's point about thinking about scale up, manufacturing, supply chain. When you need to get 50 particular critical components, that's a whole different story than if it's a factor of 10 or 100. And now it's like, oh, geez, I can't get you 500, but I can get you 150. Well, that's going to be a major problem, for the Mike and Jims of the world when they need to scale up.
Right. So I guess the question then is, all right, so I'm this lean startup. I've got 4 employees or whatever, and maybe they're all engineers, or there's a couple engineers and and a CEO or something, whatever the team makeup is. But how do they know what questions to ask? Is this something they go to the CM, as we keep talking about early, and just say, hey, help educate us as to the things that you're talking about right now? Is there an outside consultant people should hire to be in the middle? Just general advice. What would you guys say for that? I'll take Ken. You haven't had a chance a little bit.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit earlier when you're selecting that partner. I think this is one area where they can really help you on and leverage, because you've spent so much of your investment and time and energy into getting the design right, and then trying to get it to market. There's a lot of aspects into scale up that John was mentioning that happens in the background. And I think oftentimes we fail to acknowledge the amount of effort that is associated with that, such as bringing on equipment, validating equipment. So we talked a little bit about supply chain. There may be components within the supply chain that have a year lead time. At the volumes that John was mentioning, lead times can go from samples within a couple of days to now you need 400 or 500. That could be a year lead time. So these are all areas where I think that somebody that you select as a contract manufacturer might be able to help, and you can leverage and tap into that to help you at least understand what's all involved so that you can appropriately plan.
Good, thank you for that. So, we've got 10 minutes left in the main public broadcast, and I want to make sure we have time to, kind of go through for some tips and advice. Again, things to avoid, things that people aren't thinking about. So I'm going to go down the line and let each of you chime in with just, again, reflecting on some things we've been talking about so far. What are some of the, general tips or some of the pitfalls that you want to flag, red flags, things that, again, people don't know that they don't know, and that will come to bite them in a big way later, whether it's, a significant delay, whether it's a huge cost issue, whatever it might be. But what are some of the tips that, you would be giving to people if you were advising them? And I'll start with Jim.
Thanks, Paul. So, I think the first thing is don't be over complex with your device. A lot of the devices we see today, they count on software more so than hardware. And I think if you crack open any mobile device today and you look at the components that are in there, your board should mimic that componentry, mainly because that's where the market is sliding. It's going away from the larger form components into the smaller. So keep it simple. Also, feel free to reach out to CM. I know I've held conversations a few times a month with folks, and something that's very just normal and common to me, I can hear over the phone, they're just scribbling away. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a lot of stuff they didn't know. Now, contrary, there's a lot of things they're doing that I'm not aware of, but I love sharing our knowledge. I love being a part of the decision process and helping people move forward faster. So don't be afraid to reach out to a CM and have a chat. I know with us, I know Mike and I, if you call us and you want to have a chat with us, we don't charge you to have a chat. Once we get a design person involved and we're putting pen to paper and we're running up CAD and so on, then there's a cost associated with it. But I think a lot of those challenges can be headed off early by just having that conversation. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you very much, Jim. Mike, you want to build on that?
Yeah, just to build, like I said in the very beginning, right? Quality and supply chain resiliency is designed into your product, right? So don't lose sight of, how something is going to be tested, in its individual pieces as it comes together and ultimately delivers the therapy and the benefit to the marketplace and the patients that you're striving to service and support. So, those things that are easily overlooked because you're just trying to get the product to work are going to be the things that are going to derail you as you move forward, either within the supply chain or the quality of the product in a mass-produced environment.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we move on to the Merz? So who wants to go first? Jake.
Yep. So some of the same themes that we kind of touched on throughout the hour. If you're not really familiar with design controls and understanding that documentation process and how to get through the different phases from concept to design transfer, then get some expertise in that area. That will help quite a bit from a rework standpoint. As Mike mentioned, when you get to that final stage and you want to then engage in a contract manufacturer, not having that documentation in the right level really causes a lot of rework and a lot of frustration. And then finding a good partner in that space, as a startup and as a company that's working and putting their blood, sweat, and tears into a product, you're focused on launching that one product. Finding a good partner that's launched many companies, many products, gives them a wealth of knowledge to be able to lean on and share with you.
Let me follow up one thing on that, Jake. So does it matter if the partner, the CM has, does it matter if they have specific expertise in the area that you're targeting, or just are people able to kind of handle everything? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of products and the space that you're in. But, as we look for partners, we're looking for folks that have experience in our area, in our industry, in the specific indications that can lend us that kind of expertise and help. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to someone to help you in any of these different parts because you're looking for that area of expertise.
Great. And Ken.
Yeah, just to build on that from what Jake is mentioning, you guys are the experts in your device and your design, right? But as you migrate to operations production, that's where it starts to get critical to select your partners. So, you really have to vet out your partners. They can lend a wealth of information, as we all had chatted about here. And then when you're in the development process and you're looking at documentation, as Jake had mentioned, there's a number of useful tools out there. I know just even on, if you're talking about U.S. market and FDA has a wealth of knowledge and guidance documents that are out there that'll, guide you on every step of the way as part of design control. So there's a number of documents out there for you too to leverage and tap into.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. It's something that we're actually building here at MedTech Innovator with some help from FDA and others. Is a good central resource of a lot of these resources. Because I think that's something that, would be super helpful. There's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of templates, there's a lot of but people don't necessarily know where they are. So that's something that we're going to be working on. Definitely we'll be, reaching out to you guys for, any input into that, or we'll share what we're working on. That would be great. That's a really good point. And John.
Yeah, two different items. Number one, even if you have a small team, either designate somebody within that team, use somebody from the outside. Who's going to play that, alternate view, asking the what if question, being the challenger, right? Because whether it's a team in a big company or a small company, you rally around the cause and you can get, blindsided because you're so focused to make it successful, but you need that challenger. Who's going to play that challenger role, whether it's design, whether it's supply chain, what have you. And sometimes we have to just say, guess what? In this project for the next 6 weeks, Ken, you're the challenger role. You need to ask those tough questions that nobody wants to ask, that could disrupt this. And then I think we've worked with some small companies, where finances are a challenge, especially it could be in supply chain, it could be in design and stuff. I think the wealth of universities that are in the US and around the world, it's amazing what some of those can do for a very low cost or no cost, right? They're looking for student projects, professors are looking for research. And it just continues to amaze me, the level of intelligence and creativity. And they're not necessarily looking for a piece of the action. They're looking for more the experience, if it's a student or if it's a professor, for it. And there's ways to, protect the confidentiality and things. It could be, that you might need somebody just in a specific area for a 3-month period and on a part-time basis. That's another suggestion that could be a readily available resource that won't cost you a lot of money.
No, that's super creative. So how do you find those people, John?
I think in this day and age, right, the power of the internet, doing searches, you'll be amazed at, there's consortiums in certain pockets, universities, they're out there looking for, projects. I think networking, is another way, talk to your fellow entrepreneur startups, of how they, got connected with a certain person, having a chat with the Mike and the Jims of the world, that see such a diverse technology and pieces. Sometimes the best advice they're going to give you are the ones that failed, not the ones that were successful. Like, we were working with this one and it was, hey, if we did it over again as the CM, or if they did it over again, but maybe they didn't get that chance. And some of those best lessons are learned from, what failed, not what was successful.
Yep. No, I completely agree with that. We unfortunately hear that way too often, right? All of us, and that was a good learning experience, but that really just means it was a huge failure. And so I think this has been really helpful today, kind of just having this general discussion about some of the things to think about, some of the lessons. I always take away, from conversations like this, just again, that there are people like you out there, all of you, companies like Jabil, et cetera, that are willing to have those conversations early and give you some guidance and give you some advice that, as you said, won't necessarily cost you anything. You're not doing CAD designs. You're just trying to save yourself headaches down the road. And in the process, can be really helpful to startups. So we encourage people to reach out to, people like you all the time. Are all of you open if companies in MedTech Innovator wanted to reach out and ask you a question, if they watch this and they've got some follow-up questions? Is that something that, you guys would be available for?
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly, yes. Definitely, yes.
Terrific. Well, for me, this was super helpful and really useful, again, to think about a lot of these issues. I really appreciate your time, everybody. Great panel in this first hour. Remember, don't disconnect, whether you're our startups or whether you're our panelists, because we got another 30 minutes of private Q&A. But for anyone else who was on this webinar today, thank you for joining us. You'll be able to find the information on all the panelists on our website at medtechinnovator.org/live. And if you go to that page and scroll down, you'll find this panel and you'll find bios on everybody. We'll also put links to where you'll be able to contact people, at least reach them in one way or another. So we'll do that as a follow-up too. And for anyone again who's tuning in on YouTube Live, we'll have another webinar next week, same time, 10:30 on Thursday at 10:30 Pacific. And we continue the series. If you look over on the right-hand side of the page on medtechinnovator.org/live, you'll find a schedule for what else is coming up. We've got some really interesting discussions happening about partnering with health systems and payers that'll be coming up in our next webinar. So please tune in for that. Thank you again for joining us. And again, panelists, don't go anywhere. And for everyone else and our partners, of course, I mean, our startups, stay on. Everybody else have a great day, great evening.